All right, so we're going to talk a little bit. We're going to do a rod review. This rod right here, zipping around so you can actually see what it says on here. This is a Conquest, a Shimano Conquest. It's a Gloomis collaboration with Shimano. Okay. Both companies basically owned by the same people now. So they're using a little bit of both companies' technologies in order to make this rod. Now, if you want to go into the real scientific of this rod, then you're going to have to find somebody a whole lot smarter than me. I'm just going to tell you right now. Okay? But I am going to talk to you and tell you a little bit about my personal opinion after fishing this rod for a couple months and putting it through quite a few tests. I mean, I know when you hear me say that, well, you've only fished it, several months. I go fishing a little more than your average person. I'm definitely at the lake at least once a week for the most part. Sometimes if I have a few days off, I'm off several times a week. So I've been blessed to go fishing quite a bit over the last 3 or 4 months. And I have had this rod right here or one similar to it. This one here is the 844C. I've had either this or the 843C in my hand pretty much most of the time. One of the techniques that I started off using, because this was actually the first Conquest, which I've had NRXs, I've had IMX Pros, I've had the bronze backs, I've had GLXs, I've had GL2s, I've had several different kinds of Gloomis. I've had Shimano Crucials, I've had the Claris, I even had a Zodius for a little bit. So I've been blessed to trade around and have several different rods over the years. And I've had a couple other brands. I've had several St. Croix and different ones. Okay, so I've got a little bit of experience in throwing different types of rods. Okay, especially for the techniques that I'm getting ready to tell you about. One of the techniques that I'm going to tell you about, that my personal favorite for this type of rod right here, is throwing a swim jig. Now, it's not just because it's a good swim jig rod. That's not the reason why I started using it. Because originally, this was actually the first Conquest that I personally owned. I had different IMX Pros. A friend of mine, who he works at Cane Pole here in Rods, and I decided that I wanted to go ahead and trade my IMX Pro and a couple other things in order to be able to swap out and get this rod, because they are the highest end of Gloomis and Shimano rods. I mean, these are pretty much top of the line. You hear a lot of people talking about the NRXs. The NRXs are good rods. In my opinion, most of the NRXs, though, are stiffer in action. So whatever action it tells you, and every company's different. And our NRX is usually stiffer than whatever that action tells you. So if you're really wanting to do techniques, you really need to grab the rods and you need to check them out. Kind of the same thing with these right here. The sensitivity and these rods right here, to me, is the same or better than the NRX. And I had an NRX that was very similar to this. I had even an NRX Plus. Okay. To me, they both had very similar sensitivity to it. And I've used 20 and 15 pound fluorocarbon with each rod. The handles or cork handles, which these have a special wrapping around them so that it feels like it has that rubberish texture to it, that part right there, or these two and then your finger up front, which is what I do most of the time. The sensitivity that you have all the way through the rod blank is amazing. The power that you have on the hook set with this rod. This rod here actually Let me read you the specs on it. It actually is a 844C MBR, 7-foot fast heavy. So this is considered a heavy action. It's actually rated for lures 3/8 to an ounce, and it's supposed to do anywhere from 12 to 20 pound line, and that's going by regular fluorocarbon or monofilament line, which a lot of people use. I would say I'm probably one of the few people left in the world that uses monofilament for a lot of things, but I usually use fluorocarbon 90% of the time on my bait casters, and 98% of the time I'm using 15 pound red label Seaguar. I use 20 certain times of the year, but anymore I've started to go to just 15 just because it's bigger spool, easy access. You know, it's just what I do. The action that this rod has on it on the tip, let's talk about that for a minute. Okay, most rods that have this type of action, you won't see very much more movement out of the tips than that right there. Okay, I'm putting very little pressure on this rod to do this. Okay, now this rod, if I actually pull down on it, it actually bends more than most of your heavy action rods. So the tip, that's something else I'll tell you about every one of these conquests so far that I've had. The tip action is impressive, because with most fast action rods, the tip is not very sensitive. It doesn't come to a C like this does. What it does is, like, this whole thing will bend. If you wanted to pull on the front of it, this whole thing would bend. On these, it literally curves, like almost like an extra fast action would be. Okay, but this has more backbone. It's, like I said, it's very hard to explain, but for jigs, for dragging a jig, for a Texas rig application, for something that you're wanting, because a lot of people don't realize this when you're actually jig fishing, you don't want a rod that's so stiff that the tip doesn't move. A lot of people think that. A lot of people think, well, if I want to fish a jig, then what I need to do is get me a broomstick, and then when one hits, I just jerk back and he's stuck. That's actually wrong, because you want that fish to grab your bait. Okay, you want that fish to come up wherever it's at, grab your bait and swim with it for just a second, because you want him to turn his head the opposite direction. You actually want him to tighten that line and pull just a little bit, and then you want to be able to not jerk like you're pulling somebody out of a well. What you want is, you want to put enough pressure in behind your hook set, a snap, a quick pull of the line on a tight line, okay, that's what actually drives that hook. The fact that when this is in a bass's mouth, okay, when you go to set the hook, if you had a broomstick, if it doesn't catch just right, then guess what's going to happen? If he's skin hooked and you have a broomstick, you might as well wave your hand at that fish and say bye. Because if you don't hook that fish perfectly and you have a broomstick for a rod, then what's going to happen is, you're barely going to skin hook him, so you're going to get it underneath his skin and it just be a skin hanging on here, and the first time he turns his head, the first time he jumps, that fish is gone. Why? Because that hook, there's no give between that rod and that line. Okay, so you want a rod that has a little bit of tip action to help you fight that fish, so that if you don't get the perfect hook set, don't get me wrong, you need the backbone, which this has. You need the backbone to drive the hook. If you get it hooked good, that hook will come all the way through and out the sides. What we all would love to see every time we set the hook on a fish, but it doesn't always happen that way. There's that 20% that when you go to set the hook, it rolled in his mouth, he grabbed it weird, whatever happened. I took too long for the hook set, I was turned right. There's 1,000 excuses as fishermen we make. But if that doesn't get a perfect hook set, you're going to lose that fish, because all of us are pulling back and we're holding and we're just reeling as fast as we can. And the truth is that rod, that tip that rod gives us is a little bit of forgiveness. Plus, reason number 2, you want that tip action that this rod has. When you cast that jig into a brush pile, if you have a stiff like a broomstick rod, normal heavy action rod, and you start bouncing it out, it has no give. If you get close to a log or you get pinned between branches, if this rod doesn't have any bounce, then when you sit there and do this to it, trying to get it loose, it has no give. It would just bury in there deeper, or bury your hook in there deeper, because now this weed guard, it just pushes it right in. Whereas if it has this little bit of tip, it lets you bounce that and work that through that cover a lot better. This rod right here has the absolute perfect. I would say probably about 1.5 to 2 foot. It has that C to it that bends. All I'm doing right here is pushing down on this, and at the other end my reel is just floating in the air. Okay, this has that little bit of C throughout this rod. Okay, so it does have that heavy action, even though people would say, well, wait a minute, that's more of a medium heavy. No, because I'll just be honest with you. This is how a rod should be built for a heavy action that's a jig rod. The way they make this rod right here. A lot of people, I fished a lot of jig rods. I fished a lot of heavy cover, 1/2 ounce. Now, in my opinion, I started out throwing a finesse jig on this, a 5/16. I caught several fish on it. I lost several fish on it. That's when I started paying close attention, after the excitement came to me and was a little wearing off a little, that I had a conquest rod. I realized that this rod was a little too much for a finesse jig. So I started putting jigs on it that had a little bit heavier gauge, because it wasn't bending them all the way out. By the time I was setting the hook and holding on that fish, if I set it on a 3 or 4 pounder that doesn't move, then what was happening is my little finesse jig wire was bending just a little bit. So I got away from it for that, and I started using it just as a swim jig rod. And as a swim jig rod, it did fairly well. The problem is what I was telling you all ago. If you go to set the hook on a fish, another reason why you don't see me using braided line on bait casters a lot of times is because those rods are a little bit heavier action, and when you go to set the hook, there isn't a whole lot of give. So therefore, if you skin hook a fish, it's a whole lot easier for them to throw that jig than it is for them to throw some other type of bait. You see me using braided line on a spinning outfit, but it's an open hook. That open hook instant drives in. With your fishing a jig, you have this brush guard, and you have a lot of other factors that are in the way. So this rod, though, it would be a very good rod for, my opinion, this rod right here would probably make a very good frog rod. I know a lot of people use heavier ones, but in my opinion, this right here would be a real good rod for that. Has enough action to do a little bit of everything. It's real good if you were a 3/8 to 1/2 ounce flipper with jigs or soft plastics. Awesome for that. It is meant for heavy cover. If you wanted to throw big spinner baits that were 3/4 to an ounce, like those ones they throw on Cumberland at nighttime, this rod right here would be an awesome rod. Because another thing is too, most heavy action rods are super heavy. Now, I've been blessed enough that I have this on a Metanium MG. It's a Shimano. This is basically a Japanese version of the Core. Super light reel. Huge blessing to me to be able to have this. But this rod is super light. Like I said, I've had the NRXs. I would say you could sit on an RX next to this and hold the two. It'd be hard to tell which one's lighter. This one here, though, has, as far as I understand, 4 different sections of wrapping that they put on this, is why it's so tough. And yet it's still super lightweight. Like I said, for all that technical information, you're going to have to look it up. But in my opinion, that's my review of the Conquest 844C Awesome rod. It's meant for heavy cover. If you're going to use it, that's what you need to use it for. When it comes to finesse applications, it's probably what I do it the most anymore. You can get by with it, but you're going to have to be gentle on your fish and gentle with what you do. This is really meant to be a heavy action rod. That's what it's for. I mean, it is what it says. And once you fish this rod, I'm just going to warn you, you're going to be spoiled, and no other rod's going to feel the same. That's pretty much what it's done to me. The lightness, the sensitivity, the strength it has once the hook's set, you're going to be spoiled. And I guess that's pretty much why it's designed to do that. Anyway, if you're looking into getting one of these, if you see one that you're wanting to trade for and you're wondering about it, I hope this video helps you. God bless you. And don't forget, Jesus loves you. You have a great day.